What's up, everyone? This is States of America by USA Today. I'm your host, Philip M. Bailey. Our post-convention hangover is over. A police shooting of a black man has turned an American city into ground zero for protests and a stomping ground for candidates. And new polls are out. Susan Page shows us who's ahead and what topics divide voters. We're going to fact-check some recent statements by President Trump and Joe Biden. Also, how a kid kicked out of a school for wearing his natural hair could start a new debate about school choice. Let's get it. The shooting of Jacob Blake has put all eyes on Kenosha, Wisconsin. It's turned political as President Trump and Joe Biden have visited the battleground state this week to tout their versions and visions of America. We invited Mary Spacuzza, who's been covering Kenosha and is based in Milwaukee, and Courtney Subramania, a White House correspondent in Washington, D.C., to tell us what they're seeing.
Both the president and his Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, made trips to Wisconsin to highlight their political messages this week. But let's go to Mary Spacuzza, who's in Wisconsin and can tell us how those messages are playing and how their trips played out on the ground.
They're very different messages, very different tones. Obviously, President Trump was here meeting with law enforcement and National Guard and business owners who lost property or had their property damaged due to the unrest following the shooting of Jacob Blake. Vice President Joe Biden, very different messaging. He's here, he's talking about criminal justice reform, about racial inequalities. He meeting with the family of Jacob Blake. Obviously very different messages, and we'll have to see how they play out. I know some people were nervous at the beginning of the week when President Trump announced that he was coming because things have calmed down, and there were some Kenosha residents who were really worried that his visit would stir up more unrest or more violence. We have not seen that. We'll obviously be watching in the weeks to come. Things have been peaceful all week, thankfully. And I think that Wisconsin is happy to be getting visits from the president and vice president, but some have been wary of the timing, I would say.
I think both candidates' trips to Kenosha really crystallize where we're at in this election. You know, we had Biden meet with members of Jacob Blake's family. The president chose not to meet with Blake's family and instead focused his trip on members of the National Guard, praising them for quelling some of this unrest, as well as small business owners who suffered damage in some of this violence. And I think that underscores the messages that both campaigns are really trying to push. We have Trump saying, "You won't be safe in Biden's America," while we have this forceful pushback from Biden saying, condemning the violence, but also saying, "You won't be safe in Trump's America. You aren't safe in Trump's America," not only with the unrest, but with the pandemic and also with some of the economic turmoil brought on by the pandemic. I think one thing this shows us, though, is that this emphasis on Kenosha has really reframed the political debate, which is what the president wanted all along. We're talking about subjects like public safety and violence and unrest, which is, terrain the president is more comfortable with, instead of some of these issues that he pulled poorly on over the summer, like the pandemic, like systemic racism, which are issues that, Joe Biden would rather be talking about.
So I think that there's also been a lot of messaging from the campaigns. Obviously, President Trump wants to tie Joe Biden to the violent protests that we saw for several days in Kenosha before things settled down. Biden has come out now quite forcefully saying he supports peaceful protests. Looting is not a peaceful protest. Violence is not a peaceful protest. I think that there is some frustration among people that the president has not denounced Kyle Rittenhouse, the man who shot the protesters. There is a message from conservatives that it was self-defense and that he was in danger, but he was a 17-year-old from Illinois who brought a very deadly weapon into a protest scenario and ended up killing two people. So I do think that there is some discomfort there. So I do think that there's some frustration from people who are waiting for President Trump to denounce Kyle Rittenhouse and the shooting of protesters. He's a 17-year-old from Illinois who came to protest saying he wanted to defend property, but brought a very serious and deadly weapon, or got it from a friend, it's unclear, and ended up shooting 3 people, killing 2 of them. We're obviously waiting to hear more information, but I think that there is discomfort among independent voters, among suburbanites, the very suburban women that Trump is trying to win over, who I don't think want people, vigilantes or people running around with assault rifles.
One of the key moments in these trips this week, I think, was this image we had of the president standing in front of this rubble and these, smoldering ashes. And I think, that image, it was all how you interpreted it, right? You had his supporters sharing this image saying, this underscores his law and order message. This shows leadership and him taking control. But you also had his detractors sharing this photo saying, this underscores, Trump's America. This is what you'll get more of in a second term. So I think as much as Kenosha has been sort of a flashpoint in this national dialogue on race relations and police brutality, I think it's really going to be a moment in this election that we'll look back on and say, this is a moment that voters really looked to when they decided which vision of America they want in 2021.
Coming up next, Susan Page, our Washington bureau chief, is going to talk to us about new poll numbers and what they say about the 2020 voters.
This is how people in America have their voices heard.
As Labor Day looms, a new USA Today Suffolk University poll shows Joe Biden leading Donald Trump 50 to 43%. The survey also finds significant skepticism among voters about whether the election can be trusted at all. Here to dive into the details is Susan Page, Washington bureau chief for USA Today. Susan, how are you?
Hey, Philip, great to be back with you.
After the convention, it seemed like it didn't really change much as far as what Democrats thought about their convention, what Republicans thought about theirs. Did somebody come out on top as far as the independent, persuadable voters were concerned?
Each of the party conventions seemed to do one of the things they needed to do, which was solidify support among their base. So about 2/3 of Democrats and about 2/3 of Republicans told us that the conventions that their parties held made them more likely to vote for their party's nominee. So that's good for each party. But the real target were independent voters, less likely to have made up their mind. And on that, we found that independent voters by 2 percentage points, 33 to 31%, said the Democratic convention made them more likely to vote for Joe Biden. But when they looked at the Republican convention, independents said by 9 percentage points that made them less likely to vote for President Trump. So on that front, Democrats did better.
I was going to say, it looks like the persuadables were more favorable to the Democratic convention than the Republican one. The one thing, though, Susan, you and I and others, everyone in the country, we saw polls that showed Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee back in 2016, leading then candidate Donald Trump by 7%. And if you're a Trump voter, if you're a Trump supporter, you got to go, wait a minute. Media, once again, using these polls. The polls showed Hillary Clinton up and Donald Trump won anyway. You're just trying to suppress the vote or depress the vote on the Trump side. What's different about this go round as far as the survey, the polling is done, or is there any at all?
Well, almost precisely 4 years ago, we did a USA Today Suffolk poll at just this point in the campaign in late August. And we found that Hillary Clinton had a lead of 7 percentage points over Donald Trump in a ballot that included third-party candidates. And of course, she went on to win the popular vote, but to lose the Electoral College. There are some big differences, though. Joe Biden is more popular, viewed more favorably than Hillary Clinton was. Hillary Clinton had more enthusiasm behind her among Democrats than Joe Biden does. So the two races aren't exactly comparable, but for Democrats who have PTSD about what happened in 2016 when they thought they were going to win and they didn't, this is eerily similar.
One thing that the poll dives into, Susan, is the ongoing civil unrest across American cities regarding African Americans who have been shot and killed by police in these controversial shootings, whether it's George Floyd, Jacob Blake, or Breonna Taylor. One thing that I thought was striking, and this might be why President Trump continues to hit on the law and order mantra, 49% of voters say that these shootings between African Americans involving police and African Americans, 49% say it's based on the individual deed or action of the individual, whereas in 41% say it's systemic racism. That tells me that this is a reason why, or one of the better arguments for President Trump going into the election, no?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. This is one of those questions on which there's a big partisan divide. So 83% of Republicans, 83%, that's almost all Republicans, say this is a few bad apples. This is not a problem of systemic racism. But 3 out of 4 Democrats say, yes, it's a reflection of systemic racism in American society. So in a way, this is an issue that both candidates use to speak to their core supporters. Now, if we see more violence in the streets in American cities after and during some of these protests, that may affect how Americans feel about that. That is a combustible situation, but that's where it stands right now. So yes, Americans are very concerned about law and order, the message the president's delivered, but there is still a lot of sympathy and sentiment that says there's systemic racism in our society and it needs to be addressed.
Does that vandalism from some of these protests, does that sway how people think about this one way or the other? I was reading your story, and one of the things that struck me was that the more conservative folks were saying any act of violence, any vandalism, that should all just stop. Even the peaceful protest should stop because of what some folks may do, or the negative consequences of some of those protests. But on the Democratic side, those who were interviewed said, look, how else are people supposed to express themselves? They have a right to protest. It's their First Amendment right. Has the vandalism that we've seen in some of these cities and the clashes with police sometimes that have turned violent, do they change your viewpoint on this depending on your political persuasion?
I think this is a moving target. I think this is something we want to watch closely over the next several weeks of the campaign. But at the moment, Republicans, yes, overwhelmingly say, if you're going to have a peaceful protest and it leads to violence, don't have it. It's not worth it. But 6 out of 10 Democrats, now that's not every Democrat, but that's a majority of Democrats, say, if you're having a peaceful protest on a big issue, even if it's going to lead to violence, you should go ahead and have it. One of the respondents we called back and interviewed said, this is how people in America have their voices heard. So on that issue, as on so many, we find a deep divide in the American viewpoint.
One thing I notice is that mail-in voting, there's a divide on that as well. 83% of Republicans deeply skeptical, or somewhat skeptical, of mail-in voting. How does that play out in the poll, and how do you think that affects how they may vote right this November? Do they show up in person? Do they mail in? Does that depend on party as well?
Yeah, it sure does. Republicans, by more than 2-1 over Democrats, say they're going to vote on election day in person. Democrats, by more than 2-1 over Republicans, say they're going to vote by mail-in ballot or by absentee ballot. And this is going to matter because those ballots get counted in many states at a different pace. So we could have a situation where on election day, Donald Trump is doing very well with all the votes that have been counted of people who showed up in person on that day. And as those mail-in ballots get counted, that Joe Biden starts to pick up ground because that will be a disproportionately Democratic vote. And that could undermine some of the faith that people have that they can trust the vote to be fair and accurate.
Please check out this story by Susan in this poll. The sensational Susan Page, thank you for joining us here at States of America.
Hey, thank you, Philip.
Coming up, it's fact check time, looking at statements by President Trump and Joe Biden to see what is what.
If I'm your president, we're going to protect Social Security and Medicare.
The war will soon be complete, and it is working beyond our wildest expectations.
We're fact-checking the presidential candidates today. Both of these are statements they made at their respective conventions. So let's start with Democrat Joe Biden.
For our seniors, Social Security is a sacred obligation, a sacred promise made, they paid for. The current president is threatening to break that promise. He's proposing to eliminate a tax that pays for almost half the Social Security without any way of making up for that lost revenue, resulting in cuts. I will not let that happen. If I'm your president, we're going to protect Social Security and Medicare. You have my word.
What Biden said about President Trump is not that quite cut and dry. The president's executive order refers to deferring, not eliminating, the payroll tax from September 1st through the end of 2020. So that deferment will eventually go away if it's even enacted. And that's a big if, because the payroll taxes have to be made by the Treasury Department. Trump said that if he wins re-election, he would forgive those taxes and permanently cut the payroll tax. And now to President Trump. At his convention, he spoke about the border wall, one of his biggest campaign promises during the 2016 election. Let's listen to what he said at the RNC.
We have already built 300 miles of border wall, and we are adding 10 new miles every single week. The wall will soon be complete, and it is working beyond our wildest expectations.
When Trump took office, there was 654 miles of barriers on the southern border with Mexico. 3 years into his presidency, that number has increased by only 5 miles. Now, he has replaced or reinforced a couple of hundred miles of old barriers or walls, but the raw number of walls or barriers on our southern border has not increased much. So we're going to dub that false. Up next on States of America, a kid got kicked out of school for wearing his natural dreadlocks. What that says about school choice, up next.
I can't look like my white counterpart, and I just don't feel like I should be made to do that.
School choice is a hot button issue in the 2020 elections. It means giving kids a voucher to attend charter or private schools. Opponents to school choice say it's being used to defund public schools, while the other side says it's only a way to give people from low-income areas, especially people of color, access to more opportunities. But in some cases, that doesn't always work out. Joining me is Tina Johnson, a Cincinnati resident whose son was pulled from a school over its hair policy. Tina, how are you?
I'm fine, and you?
Let me start off with a personal question. People's hair is sometimes seen as a frivolous matter. You get it styled one way, you get it styled the other. Tell me why your hairstyle, your husband's hairstyle, your children's hairstyle is so important culturally to your experience.
For one, there's a bond. There's a bond associated in our family with our hair. We have 4 boys in total, and 3 of them have locks. And then, of course, mom and dad. So for us, there's definitely a family connection and a family bond. For us, it also is just a rooted and a groundness in ourselves, and just a reminder to stay there.
Your son, his name is Astin, correct? Is that how I pronounce it? Astin. Let me ask, he was attending Zion Christian Temple in Cincinnati area, in the suburbs of there, which is a private school. Why did you pull him from the school? And I guess the story that I read in the Cincinnati Enquirer was saying that he was basically attending one year, everything was fine. He shows up this year and they're saying, oh, your hair's a little too long.
Zion Temple Christian Academy is actually in the inner city of Cincinnati. It's in a primarily Black neighborhood. It's a primarily Black school, and he has been attending there for the last 3 years. So Astin did not have locks when he started school, but once he wanted to start to represent more of what his dad looked like and start to kind of emulate his style, and once he expressed a desire to look more like his dad, then we decided to transition him to locks because upon his request. So this was something that we did talk about with at least 2 teachers at the school during the school year last year when he transitioned, and this was before everybody kind of had to take a break for COVID. He was actually encouraged by those 2 teachers, so I really didn't think it was going to pose an issue this coming school year. So when Zion Temple put out their reopening plan, then I did decide to re-enroll not just Astin, but also my son, Arison, who is 3, into the pre-K program. So in doing that, the handbook does not specifically state locks are unacceptable, but it does mention hair length as in 1 inch, and it does mention braids and other, to be honest, culturally acceptable hairstyles in the Black community. So with that, then I decided there was also a blurb where it says, like, to make accommodations or to make exceptions, then you can reach out to these people. So I thought I was doing what was right by reaching out to the school to let them know, like, because I know Arison's hair is longer than Astin's. Arison's comes about to his ear. So I wanted to make sure that I made them aware of that before he started the school year. So then I was contacted via email by the secretary to tell me that basically she restated what the policy was. And then I called from there, and she told me that she would set me up a phone call with the assistant principal, which was one of the people who could make the exception. And from there, he told me that neither boys would be accepted based off of hair length and hairstyle. And he associated the braids situation or braid style or braided style to locks. And he told me that neither one would be accepted.
Now, you and your husband, I believe, Tina, have sent your son back to public school. Let me ask you, why was school choice, why was this private school so appealing to you and him in the first place?
So for one, the class sizes was a huge thing for me. It's a fairly small school, and I think his kindergarten class may have had maybe 8 students in it. And so then also coming back in an environment where there's COVID or the possibility of getting COVID from going to school, having very small classes and their reopening plan seemed appealing to us because we're both essential workers.
Now, I would think you and I have been paying attention to the news for the past few years. Cincinnati, I believe, was actually the second city in all of the United States that passed a local law, local ordinance, barring discrimination based upon hair. We've seen, I believe, the young man who was the rustler who was told by the official to cut his hair, and had to cut his hair literally while he was in the middle of a match. Is this something that, I mean, obviously, I guess because it's a private school, it's outside of the law of Cincinnati?
It was pretty big news when in Cincinnati, the Crown Act went into effect. And in that Crown Act, it also affected private schools. And that was pretty big news here in Cincinnati. So I was quite surprised when this happened this year. So I did seek legal counsel because I didn't understand how this was right. So in seeking legal counsel, I did find out that a month before enrollment, or a month before this conversation to enroll my son, they repealed that with the Supreme Court, which is very disheartening.
Repealed, I guess you're saying they repealed that section of the law that applied to private
Correct.
schools.
So basically, private schools are allowed to legally discriminate for whatever things they want to say. So if they want to say that all the boys have to look this way, all the girls have to look this way, all the boys walk sideways, they're basically able to legally discriminate.
Do you think this is something that's going to be a problem for not just, it has been for your son here, who's about 6 years old, right? He's about 6. For your other children, but also what about African-American children across the country as these appeals, mostly by Republicans and conservatives, to dip into charter schools that's certainly seen as an alternative to public schools, that we got some catching up to do, it sounds like, with the cultural sensitivity and the cultural knowledge that just because you have dreadlocks has nothing to do with your character, right? Martin Luther King said that the content of your skin and the color of your skin are the content of your character. Well, the content of your character has nothing to do with the contexture of your hair. Are you at all concerned that this will something that private schools and charter schools haven't caught up with yet? And I know you said you haven't looked at you looked to legal action that law was repealed, but do you think that there needs to be a fight to extend these laws to apply to private religious schools as well?
I think that any type of uniform policy or policy that is going to dictate appearance in any way should have cultural representation. And I feel like policies like the one at Zion Temple are not fair, and they're not relative to the culture in which you service. So I can't look like my white counterpart. And I just don't feel like I should be made to do that, or I should be made to change myself in order to fit in any way. And I feel like when it comes to locks, there's a stigma that comes with locks, and people seem to think, people who are ignorant to hair seem to think that that means that you're dirty or you're unintelligent or you must smoke weed every day. Those things are attached to having locks, and they're just not true in this case. And they're not true in a lot of cases. And so I just don't feel like my hair texture, my son's hair texture, or the length of it should be a barrier to anything that they do.